So we are super delighted to have Filiz Garip today present in the Soda Lab webinar. She is from Cornell University, professor of sociology, director of the Center for the Study of Economy and Society. And amongst others, she has written a recent survey on machine learning for sociology. She's published in all the top sociology journals, also in demography journals, and has a background in engineering. And that's the kind of person we love at Soda Labs, with a very broad view of the world. The paper she's presenting today is work she does with an economist and an environmentalist, and different from many people working on developing countries. She's traveled there and has done stuff on the ground and knows what she's talking about, which is fantastic. So we all look very much forward to hearing about migration from Mexico to the US. Thanks, Filiz. She is willing to take questions along, so feel free to raise your virtual hand and then we'll take questions. Thanks, Filiz.
Thank you so much. So let me start by sharing my screen, and hopefully I'll be able to follow the questions at the same time. Let's see. Everyone can see the slides? Okay, so as you can see, first thing you'll see is I have a lot of collaborators on this project, and today I'll talk about two related papers that feed into each other. So the first one is, Mario Molina, a former student in sociology, now a postdoc at NYU, Abu Dhabi, has taken the lead. And the faculty collaborators are Nancy Chow, who's an economist, and Amanda Rodewald, who's in the Natural Resources Department here. And then the second set of the analyses I'll present are with Julia Zhu, who's in policy analysis and management. She's an econ PhD candidate there. And yeah, so we're just trying to figure this question out together. So this was not an area that I was working in. I'm a migration scholar, but until recently, I never considered the link between migration and environmental events. But as we all can guess, this is becoming a more important driver of migration. Given climate change, we expect the frequency and severity of climate events, weather events to increase over time, and already we see human displacement linked to other changes. And existing research talks mainly about gradual changes in weather, so looking at fluctuations in precipitation and temperature. There's also some work on sudden onset events like disasters, and we have some work on that, but today, it's not at a level to be presented yet. So today I'll only talk about how gradual changes over time have impacted migration flows. And some findings are already established in the literature. In the case of Mexico-US migration, economist Kaivan Munshi's work is well known. So he has linked low rainfall in Mexico to more US-bound migration. Later work tested the mechanism underlying this link, and looking at rural communities and looking at agricultural yields. Fang and colleagues also linked low rainfall to US migration. This appeared in PNAS, and later work questioned some of the findings and argued that the results did not hold under more stringent empirical specifications, but at least, it's consistent with Munshi's results. So some findings make sense, and we see it over and over across different data, but other findings are really mixed and puzzling in this line of work. For example, Rios Mena and colleagues found out that low rainfall in Mexico leads to more migration, but only in better off communities, so only in communities with resources. But then when they looked at the effect of temperature, they observed the opposite pattern. High temperatures, which have a negative impact on agricultural yields, led to more US migration, but only in poor communities. And they did not have a good explanation for that. So this is just one example, but this line of literature is actually filled with mixed results. depending on how people measure weather, what communities they look at, what kind of interactions they consider, you can basically find any result that you're looking for. And the problem is we don't have guidance from theory here, right? It's difficult to know what the correct specification for weather fluctuations is, and we can think about it in many different ways. So first thing to note that communities have different normals to begin with. Right, so we don't want to compare a traditionally cold community with a traditionally hot community, and we want to correct for a community's its own history. And studies do that quite differently. So some people argue that we have to look at the long-term norm between 1960 and 1990 is a typical normal period. Other studies argue that we need to look at the last decade, and we look at the changes from that. So that leads to different results. Also, we might expect weather fluctuations to have a delayed response, and we don't know what the appropriate lag time is. Again, studies are using different lags. Some studies go back 3 years, 4 years. Some studies focus on just the current year and the previous year, and that affects the results. There's also kind of potential nonlinear response when it comes to weather. You can expect a cumulative response. For example, lack of rain in 1 year might not mean much to a community if there's an irrigation system, but over time, if there's additional years where even the irrigated water is depleted, then you might suddenly see this response. Or you might observe the opposite. You might observe a decaying response when a community adapts to a situation, switches crops, or comes up with a new technology so that you don't see the same effect. So this is just to say that it's really hard to know what is the best way to go about this what is the best measures are. So basically, if we look at the impact of weather fluctuations, we can expect complex interactions between contemporary weather and past weather at various lags. We can expect interactions between precipitation and temperature. We can also expect interactions between weather and other factors, like the Rios-Mena study figured, how much a household makes, whether the community has certain resources or an irrigation system. These can all affect the weather response. And the question we can ask is, how do we consider all these complex interactions in one model? So the problem is we might end up with a model with more parameters and observations. So if we wanted to include all the indicators that we could think of, suddenly we run into the issue of data, and we don't have enough data to consider all the cells in the combinations that we're considering. And even if we were able to fit the models, we might overfit the data at hand, and our models may not generalize to other data sets. So basically, these are conditions that almost seem perfect for an application of machine learning tools. And those tools basically allow us to fit complex models and also avoid overfitting the data. So, maybe I don't need to kind of go over this, but machine learning obviously seeks to automate discovery from data. And in older intelligent systems, basically, the way you built those systems was trying to think of all the contingencies, all the outputs for associated inputs, and you hard-coded these decisions. But now we let the data actually discover some of these relationships. And like Sasha mentioned, with Mario Molina, we wrote a review article on this targeted at sociologists. And there we talked about different methods of machine learning, different classes. Unsupervised learning I've used in some of my earlier work to classify migrants into different groups. And here you're not trying to link the input to some output, but instead you're trying to observe patterns, identify patterns in some existing input. But here in this study, we're looking at supervised machine learning tools, where the idea is to link an input X to an output Y, and with the purpose of making predictions on new data, not on the data set that you're using to fit your model. And again, maybe some of this discussion is unnecessary, but this is very different from the typical approach that we take with something like OLS, where we use a simple model, we estimate the models from parameters from the data, and then we interpret these parameters. But we often ignore model uncertainty, and we don't consider out-of-sample performance. In supervised machine learning, we consider complex, non-parametric models, and our goal is predictive accuracy. But then the downside is we might end up with a black box model. We often do not get insights into what the mechanisms linking X to Y are. So basically here, we're using SML, and the premise, I mean, the question we're asking is very simple. Can we really predict migration at the individual level? And then can we predict it better when we consider weather as an input? So how much does weather improve our predictions? So the method that we're using here is based on regression trees. So basically, this is a tree-like model. There's a sequence of splits in the input space X, and there's a associated prediction at the end node. So it's very good at capturing nonlinearities and interactions in X, the tree-like structure. To give an example, if we wanted to predict migration as 0-1 outcome, and let's say that we have age and education as the predictors, we can imagine the tree first splitting the sample into young and old, and then each branch splitting further by education as college, non-college educated people, and then we would have a prediction at the end of each of these nodes. So with enough splits, you can imagine that we can perfectly predict our data, but again, we would be overfitting the data. We would be explaining it too well, and our model would not generalize. So basically, you want to put some restrictions on this approach so that you have good fit, good predictive accuracy at the same time. So basically, a version that we're using is random forests. So this is a version of the trees that average over thousands and thousands of trees, and it leads to more accurate predictions, but then the results are less interpretable than the perfect branching structure that I showed you. So you don't really learn much about the relationship between X and Y. You can still look at different inputs and see which have more predictive power, but other than that, you don't gain the kind of insight that we get from parametric simpler models. So the setting we have is Mexico-US migration, the largest international migration in the world, and the data comes from the Mexican Migration Project. So this is a survey data that began its collection in 1980s. And the way it works is every year, researchers select 2 or 3 communities in Mexico in regions that have high migration rates, and they go to these communities and they randomly select 200 households, and they collect information on everyone in the household. And if a migrant is absent in the US, they'll ask a proxy about that migrant, and they collect retrospective life histories. So over the years, we have information on 170 communities in this way. And because of these retrospective life histories, we can create a pseudo panel structure that covers between 1980 and 2018 pretty well. So in the end, we have about 140,000 individuals in this data, and about 20,000 of them have migrated to the US at least once in this time window. So we take these communities and community boundaries, and we overlay weather data from the NASA Earth Observing System. So these are gridded data that covers every kilometer square space on Earth, and they're available on a daily basis starting in 1980. So this is where our data begins. And this is kind of one of the first lessons that we learned. So when we were looking at Munshi's work and some of the other studies, we realized that they were measuring weather at the state or at best at the municipality level. But then with the NASA data, we're now able to measure it at the community level, which is a much smaller administrative unit. So we wanted to see if that made a difference. And this figure is actually trying to convey that information. So here we're showing the precipitation in Mexican states in year 2000, and we're showing it in deviation form. So deviation from the mean in a so-called normal period between 1980 and 1984, and the distance, the deviation is measured in standard deviations. So basically the redder or the pinker states have received less rain than their normal in the 1980s. So basically we see that there's not much change if we look at the map on the left, which is at the state level, but then we can reproduce the same map at the municipality level. And there you can see how much variation there can be even in the same state. So if we look at the state of Sonora in the green rectangle, at the state level, we see that there hasn't been much change. So the rainfall has remained more or less the same because the shade is almost white. But then if we look at the municipalities, we can see all these microclimates within the same state. So that makes a big difference. So our unit of analysis here is even finer than the municipality, so at the community level. And then some of these communities have 1,000 residents. So they're really, really tiny. So we basically take these 1 kilometer square grids and average them within the community boundary. And that makes a big, big difference. And the same thing with temperature. Basically, state level information obscures the variation that we can see at on a finer scale. So basically, the output that we want to predict is whether someone takes a first US trip. So we only focus on first trips. We have information on additional trips as well, but we kind of worry about things changing in people's lives due to migration. So we focus on the first response. And we include a number of inputs. Here I've listed both kind of exogenous or like potentially endogenous inputs, but we kind of experiment with what if we excluded potentially things that potentially might be a result of weather, and the results don't change much. Okay, so here's kind of the exciting part for us. I said earlier that it's hard to know how to specify weather. And with these machine learning tools, the more indicators you have, almost like the idea is it's better. So we can basically put in everything that we can think of, everything that people have thought of. We can also include them on many, many lags. So here we included, every year of lag in the last 5 years, but we can go back like 10 years and even more, and also kind of let the model posit interactions between them. So this is kind of what we do here. And then obviously, like in most machine learning applications, we do some form of data splitting. And this is not an issue that we think about in OLS because we kind of are trying to get the best in sample fit. We're not thinking about out of sample predictions. And so we use the same data to select the model, to assess its performance, and so on. In SML, we want to be able to predict out of sample. So we use separate data sets to fit a model, which we call training data, to select the best one among them, which is called the validation data. And then finally, a data that we don't touch until the very end of the project, where we're assessing the performance of the final model. So this is a test or held out data. So we have 140,000 individuals in the data set. So we treat 50% of them, we put them in the training data. The remaining 50% we split equally between validation and test data, and we haven't touched the test data yet. Okay, so the question is, can we predict migration? So if we're really naive about this, yes, we can predict it really, really well because of the imbalance in the data. Now, migration is a rare event. So we have 2 million person years in the data, but only 20,000 migration events. So less than 1% of the observations. So if we have a model that predicts non-migrant all the time, it's accurate 99% of the time, right? So if we kind of take this into account, if we want our model to separate migrants from non-migrants, we don't do that well. Well, we actually do okay in the training data. So here we're showing our predictions, and we see that we can predict non-migrants almost perfectly 100% of the time, but with migrants, we do less well. We can predict a migrant with 87% accuracy. But then this is in the training data. So when we look in the validation data, terrible results. So non-migrants, we do well. That's the majority of the sample, but with migrants, we have 6% accuracy. Then we can play around with cost, we can introduce costs into mispredicting one group over the other. So one lesson from here is if we didn't look at the validation data, we would clearly be overfitting the training data. So in other words, we would think we are doing well. We have 87% accuracy, but then the validation data actually shows us that, we're not doing well at all. Now, what if we introduce some restrictions into the complexity of our model so that it's not fitting it so well in the training data, but it generalizes on the upside to the validation data. So we do some of that. We also try to correct for the imbalance in the data by changing the relative costs of making mistakes for migrants and non-migrants. And again, that changes things a little bit. For example, here we made 1 million times costlier to mispredict migrants than non-migrants, and our predictions for migrants improved from 6% to 53% in the validation data. But now the predictions for non-migrants have gone down in their accuracy. And again, if we keep increasing the cost, we'll do better and better in one class, but then do worse in the other class. So this is just some of the trade-offs that we're doing. What if we pick the best model that that was the best for us. Can we predict migration better when we consider weather? So this is yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Just a quick question. When you
Sure.
said you split the data, how did you exactly split the data? Did you split across time?
So we split it by people, right? So from each community, we set aside, randomly picked, 50% of the sample and said, this is our training data, so that every person year later on would come to that group. So we split it by people instead of, person year level.
So usually you would also split by time, because otherwise you would learn features from the future and apply them in the past. That's why usually you could not split in that way.
So it actually does not make much difference in this case. I think that's kind of a great point, because each community was surveyed in a different year. So in every year we have about 3 communities. So if in every community we're picking 50% of the people into our training data, and if we're doing this in every community, because every community is starting in a different period, I don't think that would make much of a difference.
It's the thing, the function you learn. So you learn a nonlinear function between the feature mappings to people, and that function to be predictive. If you train on someone in the future and learn the mapping from those feature to those people, that's an easier task if you test that in the past, because the relationship might have changed over time. So that's why usually you don't just split by people. You also just look at communities in later in your training set, because when you validate, then you will have used information from the future to predict the past.
Yes. So this is actually an interesting question, because, we talk to computer scientists here as well. And when we're fitting the regression model, it's easy to tell the model that this is the same person. This is the data from the same person. But here we're doing none of that, right? So it's like every person year is an observation. And if I'm a person in the data, maybe I have like 40 years of data, but then the algorithm can never tell it's me if my features are changing over time. So do you know anything about this? Like, do you have an approach for this?
Yes. So what you do in that case, like you create like synthetic people.
Okay.
So essentially, like in that case, you create, it's fine to train on the same people you've used in the past. You just need to be sure that so you can train on people in the past. You just need to be sure that the time distinction is honored. So let's say if I have repeated observation of individuals in a cohort in 2000, yes, you can train on them, but then when you apply the model in 2005, it doesn't matter that those people already have been trained on, as long as they are synthetic enough, meaning the features, each individual person has its own feature space, which is dependent on time.
Okay. So I'll email you to see if you can direct me to some examples on this, but this is super, super helpful, because, I think a lot of the work was basically coming up with this weather data and trying to think about at what level we measure weather and matching it with survey. But then the other big part was like, how do we take this survey that has the structure and how do we convert it to one that makes sense? So I don't think we've completely figured it out, but yeah. But what you're saying is that whatever predictions we have are almost too good to be true, and our model has an advantage. And you'll see that even with this model, we don't do that well. So that actually does not take away from the main point, but
Well, I mean, it's all, the thing is, the problem with the next thing is if you violate the train test split in that way, it does not necessarily mean that the results are better than in reality. Because what simply could happen, that the model overfits on something that happens in the future, and I've seen this a lot of times, and then if you test it in the past, it does no longer hold, because you have overfitted.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. Okay, so we definitely need to look into this, definitely. So I'll email you, so thanks for that. Any other thoughts or questions, or can I just continue?
Oh yeah, just to grab the opportunity. Filiz, do you have information whether the farmers are holders of weather index insurance?
Yeah, so we don't in the data, but I did some qualitative work there. And so there are time periods in which such insurance becomes available from government. So on some level, you can have like this year indicator that shows there is insurance, there isn't insurance, and sometimes it's like state specific. But it's interesting, in the field work, people say that the insurance never pays and it's a scam. So I don't know if this is the case. I know like economists think maybe people are like not being accurate, but it's like I haven't seen any evidence that it works on the ground, but we don't have specific data on that yet.
Yeah, thank you.
I have another question or another point of clarification related to what Klaus said. Rather than have one in sample and one out of sample data set, which is contiguous in time, you may want to have various periods where you estimate a model, test it in the next period, estimate a model, test it in the next period, and so on. And there you're looking for for consistent results or patterns to ensure that depending on the technique you're using, such as neural networks, they're not robust, so outliers can influence them. They may not even be stable, so different data sets can influence them. So what you're looking for is a consistent pattern of nonlinear function estimation.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Paul.
You're welcome.
Okay, so basically here, this graph is showing, the true positive rate to false positive rate. It's a ROC curve. So with no weather data. So basically the higher the curves, like the larger the area under the curve, the better is the performance. With no weather data, it's slightly less good, the predictions. And when we introduce weather data, we improve a little bit, but not by a lot. So basically area under the curve where the maximum is 1 with the perfect model is 0.79 for no weather, like the model with no weather. When we introduce weather data, it improves only slightly. Now, can we predict migration better with this data? Only slightly. So I don't think, maybe kind of Klaus is right. So maybe there's something going on that would improve the model. But at the same time, like we compared it to a basic logistic regression here with a few well-selected indicators, and the results were not so much worse compared to the SML. So basically a simpler model does almost as well as the ML in this case. And this is in line with a recent work, I'm not sure how many of you have seen, but there's a mass collaboration effort spearheaded by a sociologist, Matt Salganik. So basically they started this competition to predict life outcomes in the fragile families data. So this is a panel survey that has been tracking the same families over since I think 2000. And there was a new way of the survey coming. So they treated that as held out data, and they gave people, past data to train and validate their models. And 160 teams competed in this effort. So basically what they found was, regardless of the ML method that they used, the predictions were not good, and they were not better than a simple OLS model with expert chosen indicators. So I wrote a commentary on that article, and some of the points I made there actually apply to this here. So look, why might that be? Why aren't we able to predict these outcomes? So maybe, as Klaus was saying, maybe we don't kind of take into account the survey structure in a particular way. This longitudinal dimension of the data is not well accounted for in these models. Or maybe our survey data are missing some aspect of people's lives. Or, life outcomes at the individual level are kind of idiosyncratic, and there's a ceiling to predictability at there. So as social scientists, maybe we can get at aggregate patterns, aggregate relationships, but maybe we can't predict everything for each and every individual. And, these data sets, I can't say this for the Mexican Migration Project data, but the Fragile Families data had 4,000 observations, 4,000 individuals. So it's not that large. I think MMP is better with 140,000 people observed over, 30, 40 years, but still maybe these data are not large enough to capture these relationships. And the upside of this is actually our existing parametric simple models actually perform really well, especially if we have domain knowledge. So in the second part of the talk, I want to talk about a project where we're taking the opposite route. We're starting from fieldwork and trying to build a model that represents the reality on the ground or what we're hearing from people, and testing particular relationships that we focus on. So the domain knowledge here obviously comes from the scholarship that we are all aware of, but also from fieldwork. So last summer, I did a fieldwork in Mexico, and this is when we were able to travel, and we went to Chiapas, the mountains in Chiapas. So this is the border of Mexico with Guatemala. And we talked to coffee producers there. So the effect of climate change on coffee production is well known. So we wanted to talk to them. We also talked to corn growers in Jalisco. So Jalisco is a central western state, and it's one of the biggest senders of migrants to the US. So we wanted to see if these relationships were obvious to people, or if people could point us to things that maybe we wouldn't be able to anticipate. So some things were really obvious. So it's weather now, as farmers told us, is a lot more unpredictable compared to even 5-10 years ago. So for example, a corn farmer in Jalisco talked about, like 10 years ago, he could guess how much rain would come and how that would affect the lake and the productivity of their crops, but now they can't tell. And so they invest money and then they end up losing it if there's a sudden drop or increase in rainfall. And a coffee farmer in Chiapas said the same thing. In the back in the time, they knew when summer would start, they knew when to prepare for the new season, but nowadays rainfall can come in January, February. It's this unpredictability that's leading to a lot of loss. Now, this was something interesting that I didn't know, and I didn't know from reading the literature either. They talked about how weather comes in different combinations. So basically, rainfall and temperature are not necessarily independent dimensions, but nowadays you have rain, but with rain you have increased heat. So the effect of rain is not the same over time. So that was actually something useful. And then obviously, this is not surprising, bad weather reduces the harvest. So the crops don't grow as much as before. So there's a decline in their productivity. And then poor harvest actually leads to debt, because they need good harvest in one year to have savings to buy the things that they need for the next season. So losing things in one season also affects the next season. And, this farmer talked about this being a really critical situation for people. And then migration is an obvious alternative to people. So one coffee farmer said there's no coffee produced anymore, and that's why young people are leaving. The other farmer said there are no wages and people need to make a living, and that's why they're leaving. But then they talked about how costly it was to migrate and how migration itself brought about debt, and they need to borrow money. And then if we connect it to what we learned before, debt from poor harvest can actually stall migration if you don't have the necessary resources. So this makes us expect heterogeneity by household wealth status. So what if we incorporate these insights into our analysis and test some of these relationships? So basically the empirical specification, the goal here is to link precipitation and temperature in previous time period to first US trip. And we also look into the year before that. We don't go farther in time because we're going to consider interactions between different items, and then we don't want to end up with an unmanageable model. And here, this is an obvious compromise compared to SML, where we actually let the data to pick the best relationships for predicting out of sample. And we include a number of inputs at the individual household level. We also include state times year fixed effects into this model. Now, here are some of the insights that we're trying to bring into the empirical specification. So we include interactions between precipitation and temperature, which turn out to be really, really important to understand how different combinations matter. We also consider the full spectrum of weather events. So in the literature, you often see people focusing on bad events. So how does a drought affect you? How is a lack of rainfall and all of these things? But then good weather also matters because it allows people to save and maybe make up for the losses from the previous year. And we also compare, and this is kind of pretty standard in the literature, each community to its own normal. So this way we're taking into account adaptation. So this means that really hot weather in a normally cool community is not the same thing as really hot weather in a normally really hot place, right? Because in the latter place, people have already adapted, so we don't expect the same response. And then we introduced, interactions between, weather events in the previous time versus 2 years ago, because we think sequences of weather might matter. Having 2 bad years in sequence might intensify the effect of weather. Having 1 good and bad might maybe alleviate the situation. So we want to be able to model these things and see how exactly things work. And then we test for heterogeneity by household wealth status. Now, again, we're using the Mexican Migration Project, but we're not using the entire data set. So here we're really interested in understanding the mechanisms underlying these relationships. So this is not data driven by any means. So we're focusing on rural communities where agricultural production is the main, source of livelihood. We actually also have administrative data at the municipality level on which, crops were produced in each community, but that data turned out to be a nightmare. So we're not using that yet, but we have it, and potentially in the future we can use it. And the assumption is that agriculture is the main mechanism, and this has reduced our sample to 56,000 individuals from 140,000 individuals. And then again, we're focusing on the first migration trip. We take the 1980 to 1990 as the normal period, and then every weather indicator is measured in terms of deviation from this normal in the same kind of region divided by the standard deviation. And then we consider the full spectrum of events. So we create 5 categories divided by, standard deviations. So very wet weather is when you're 2 standard deviations above the normal weather in the 1980s, and so on and so forth. Now, what do we find here?
Can I ask you one thing?
Yeah.
So you mentioned that some people change crops in order to recover cash. And I'm wondering whether that also introduces a further path dependency. So once you swap to a different crop, that makes you more vulnerable to, I don't know, the next hit. And how easy is it to switch back?
Yeah. So I think that there's been a big shift in Mexico after NAFTA in 1994, where corn imports started coming in from US. So the local farmers, especially small farmers, could no longer compete with the US corn. So you see a big switch around that time. But the switch, I think for very few households, involves switching to a different crop. So usually you have farmers renting their land to berry producers, avocado producers, renting their land for agave production. So I think agave plant is interesting because it takes 6 years to develop. So once you rent it out, you're out for 6 years. So they're kind of moving out of agriculture in this way. So that's kind of the one main shift that I can think of. And in another paper with Nancy, we find this 1994 period and the input of trade to be as influential as changes in weather. But other than that, at the individual or household level, like we don't have that kind of information. So there is information on what they're producing, but it's cross-sectional. It's only at the time of the survey. So we don't see that shift. But at the municipality level, this administrative data actually has that information. And you can see both the yield and like different things that were being produced in terms of area, in terms of money, how much they got. But that administrative data is also very messy. And we're hearing from Mexican scholars that we shouldn't trust Mexican administrative data also. So I don't know how much that's going to be helpful, but we're also thinking in those directions.
Filiz, can I ask another question?
Please, Paul.
I recently learnt about the fact that we shouldn't be measuring climate change in degrees Celsius, but change in wet bulb temperature. And the reason that the climate scientists said that that's the way we should be thinking about things is there's a sharp threshold at which people can no longer sustain themselves without air conditioning once the wet bulb temperature is exceeded. Yeah. And I was thinking about that in the context of your presentation, and I was wondering whether, and I think that sort of effect would create a sharp non-linear a pattern in your data. Now, obviously, we haven't observed that in most of the empirical data sets we have, but you could simulate it. And
Yeah.
you could simulate it in sort of a cascading way where, you know, apparently equatorially is where they expect the effect to occur first. And so you could then look at the cascading effects on migration as a consequence and crops and so on.
Yeah, I think that would be really cool. So yeah, I think, so we've talked to agricultural economists to think about these different thresholds for different crops. And I think for a long time, we were trying to customize our measures so that the measure we used for each community reflected the crop that community relied on the most. So that for different crops, like for one crop, it could be 29 degrees Celsius. For another crop, it could be 32 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
But again, we quickly learned that would be super hard to do, because it's like these thresholds are well established for a number of crops, and people quickly told us that it depended on the soil. So it wasn't like a clear-cut threshold that corn would be 30 degrees Celsius, but it depended on all these other things. And somebody even said this is more of an art than science. So then at that point we thought, okay, so let's do the main effect things first. But I think I completely agree. So one of the measures that we used here is, so 30 degrees Celsius is a threshold used by agronomers a lot, because apparently over 30 degrees Celsius, a lot of crops start suffering. So we created measures that counted the consecutive days over 30 degrees, or the total number of days over 30 degrees.
Yeah.
And the results are consistent with average temperature, more or less. But, you know, I agree. I think the next step here, in addition to kind of identifying these average effects, is basically looking at these particular patterns, because that's where the differentiation is going to happen. And we want this for our predictions, right? So we want to know which community is going to be able to send migrants, and we want to do something there, not everywhere in Mexico. So that's crucial.
Yeah, and I suspect it's the most important change, and also one which a nonlinear approach could measure, where a standard linear approach could not easily measure. So there could be some value add there.
Well, some economists are using machine learning type tools to discover these thresholds in the US. So I read one paper where they were looking at soybeans versus corn, and they were like using these predictive models to kind of like try to figure out at what temperature in the Midwest you see these sudden drops. And I think that's also a useful approach, because as far as I understand, I don't think there's kind of a well-set limit that is generally applicable. So maybe kind of that's another interesting direction where the first approach could be really helpful.
And even for human beings, irrespective of the crop, you know, human beings above a certain temperature cannot survive above what. So that would be a universal for you, perhaps.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul.
You're welcome. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, as I said, like this thing that the farmer told us, that now it rains, but it's also hot at the same time, this combination turned out to be really, really important. And we discovered that rainfall by itself and temperature by itself, changes in one dimension without changes in this other dimension, does not create much of an impact. But when combined together, when there's a sudden increase in temperature and drop in rainfall, that's when we see the migration response. So maybe this was the most important thing that we learned, that interestingly came from our field work. And then we found that both good and bad weather are crucial in understanding this, the migration response. And then there is really, stark heterogeneity by wealth status. So of households. So basically rich households migrate when last year's weather is bad, period. So they can respond immediately. So here's an example. So we're looking at very dry and hot weather. So this is, not great weather for crop production. And we see wealthy families giving a positive response, poor families not being able to do so. Same thing with dry and very hot. And this is a persistent pattern in our data with many of the measures. Rich households can migrate within the next year if there's unfavorable weather for crop production. Now, poor households migrate, by contrast, when last year's weather is good. And here we see no response from rich households. So rich households don't respond to increasing resources from good weather from last year. So that's the mechanism we imagine. But let's say when it's wet and cool in a community, poor households presumably save money, and now they can afford the cost of migrating. Now, if we dig deeper into this and consider sequence of weather events, so what happened 2 years ago, last year, and we see that these sequences really matter, but only for poor households. So again, rich households can migrate immediately. So they're not looking backward 2 years ago to decide, can I migrate? But for poor households, the migration is highest when the weather is bad 2 years ago, followed immediately by good weather. So you incur losses, you can make up for them, you can save a little bit, and then you can send a migrant. So basically, what are kind of some of the things that we've learned? And we're still kind of pushing forward with the ML project and also on this project as well. So one thing is clear, migration offers an adaptation strategy to weather. And here, a lot of the literature is talking about permanent migration, like in Bangladesh, there's kind of increasing waters and people have to be relocated. But here, migration is a temporary adaptation strategy. And we can actually look at repeated migration moves, and when people return, we actually see that many of these migrants go, stay for a bit, poorer households stay longer than richer households, and eventually come back, especially if the weather is getting better. But we see this kind of big difference in who has access to this strategy, this adaptation strategy. So we see rich households can resort to it immediately, but poor households actually cannot. And this kind of creates concerns about inequality in the long run. Who's going to be able to fight the effects of climate change, and who's going to be actually left behind without any resources? And then, you know, from an academic or perspective, one thing that I've learned is the importance of combination and sequencing of weather events in modeling these relationships, and also the full spectrum of weather events, not good, not bad, but both of them, including normal weather as well. It's crucial in understanding weather migration link, and also the level of aggregation, the kind of finer scale that we can get at. Maybe even the community is too large. If we can look at even microclimates within the community, or consider geographic structures within community, where a lake is, where a mountain is, what the soil level is like, I think we can understand this a lot better. And then one kind of upside is, you know, I think for a lot of people, there's a huge cost to learning machine learning tools, especially for sociologists. I think many sociologists don't have this kind of training. But here we see that actually domain knowledge can make up for not having access to maybe ML tools, at least in this instance. If we have well-specified parametric models, they can offer us insight into the mechanisms, underlying mechanism. But also kind of, I want to underline that non-parametric ML methods are also useful in understanding whether we can predict things and how much we can explain. I think sometimes we look at the R-squares in our OLS and they're overly optimistic. We think we can explain 25% of the variation. But when we test these things on kind of a different data, we might be disappointed. So that's kind of one lesson that I take to everything now. Maybe this data splitting thing is a good idea, regardless of what method you're using. So thanks again for listening to this talk. And I already got great ideas, and I'll reach out to you with more questions.
Okay. I think Laura has a question.
Yes. Hi, Filiz. Thank you for the talk. It was very. I have just a quick question on. So I have two questions. One is in the first exercise, whether you considered the rules of the of the US, whether they changed and how easy it was to kind of migrate. So for instance, like Trump, the migration policy was so harsh that people were discouraged. So even with a bad event, you wouldn't necessarily migrate in the US just for the fear of being caught if you are illegal. So this is one thing I didn't understand, whether rules, like the rules in the destination countries were something that, because really like migration is so low internationally because most countries have strong restriction on flow of people. So I thought probably whether you have incorporated that. And my second question is instead about intra-Mexico migration, because I'm thinking I'm poor, so I cannot afford to go to the US. So my best alternative is just move to communities down. And I don't have to move the whole family because I can commute potentially. And I find a job just so that we can survive this bad year. And so I wanted to know whether you had some information about migration within Mexico.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I mean, both great questions. So I'll start from the second. We do have data on internal migration. And this is actually interesting because the results on weather migration link are strongest in the literature for internal migration. So people have long argued using the same data set, the MMP data set, that, like you said, international migration is very costly. So maybe internal migration is the first strategy that you take. But interestingly, when we apply this kind of strategy, like full spectrum of weather events and all these kind of things, and basically not including endogenous factors, all of like this clean specification that we worked so hard at, we don't see much going on for internal migration. So we can replicate other people's results if we cherry pick some weather indicators. If we say we're going to focus on really low rainfall, bad weather events in this period, so we can replicate them. But with this specification, the signal is in international migration, not in internal migration, which is something to be explained. So I'm not sure kind of what's going on in there, but that's kind of surprising that it doesn't. I would have expected the internal migration response to be higher, but in this case, it's not. One explanation that I have is that many families already have someone in the cities working, right? So this is not something new. So I think maybe kind of it doesn't impact new migration. And again, we're looking at first internal migration trip. We're not looking at any internal migration trip. So the results might be different if we considered any move. And there we would get this kind of, maybe one person is taking on this strategy and others are not taking on new internal migration. But that's kind of puzzling. The second question is, yes, the US policy, we have indicators on number of visas available and, the level of apprehensions, the number of US patrol agents, and also like how much money US is spending. Thankfully, we don't cover much of the Trump years in this data set. And, the data becomes really sparse after 2016, because I would think it would be really depressing to look at that. But interestingly, with Nancy Chow, we have another project where Nancy was interested in understanding how, weather changes or, would impact the routes that migrants are taking. So her intuition was, well, people have to cross deserts. And this goes back to Paul's question, right? So the temperature in deserts is already kind of unbearable. If it's going slightly higher, then kind of the danger of death is a lot higher. And so she thought maybe kind of climate change would not just affect whether people migrate, but like which routes are they taking? Like where are they crossing? And interestingly, we found a little bit of that, but we found more of an impact of US migration policies, because in the US, in different years, you have different sectors of the border being more protected. So you have suddenly this initiative in the Arizona region, and suddenly all the border patrol agents are being hired there. And we see these changes having a bigger impact than weather, but it definitely makes a huge difference. So once the policy shifts from one sector to the other, you can actually map it. So if you kind of draw these maps, if you draw a network of places, you see immediately people shifting to the other side of the border with data. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You briefly touched on family stuff. How does that dynamic play out? Is it typically that somehow prime age male goes first and then scouts the US and then the rest of the family follows, or they move together, or what's the typical pattern?
Yeah, so I mean, this is the work I did before this mostly. So I mean, there's a time pattern, definitely. So in the 1960s, 1970s, it was almost always household head men. So these were people who had young families, had just married, maybe kind of a young kid, and they would be the ones to migrate. And then in the 1980s, you have younger profile of people. So this is when there's a big crisis in Mexico for 10 years. And then people are sending their sons, younger sons, not just the household head. And then later on, you have women migrating with more visas becoming available and more family migration happening. I think with this climate migration, for farming families, usually the oldest son or the household head remains behind to take care of what's there. And usually it's the younger son who's migrating because that son is not needed in farming back home. So that's a little bit different than, other migration patterns. But then we're kind of making assumptions because the households, whether household is a farming household or not, is measured on the survey year. So we're assuming in the past also, like this is a fixed characteristic which may not be. But yes, there is a little bit of that pattern that I didn't talk about.
Filiz, following up on that, so networks are important for international migration, and in your data you have very localized weather, so especially when it comes to the deeper legs of the weather shock. So the coefficient, let's say, on the weather shock 2 years ago could not only have a direct impact on the household, but drive already migration of the surrounding households to the States. And then I'm more likely to migrate 2 years further down the road because my neighbors have already sent their son up there. And I guess you could control for that somehow because you have sort of a repeated cross-section, you could look at each year how many people were sent off. You don't know, obviously, whether they are connected, but given that they live in the small community and it's Mexico, they know each other, I guess the likelihood is large. And then maybe, interact it with the lag terms to pick up this network effect or disentangle the network effect from the direct effect on the household.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So we've done a worse version of that, I'll say. So we estimated the same model between separately for communities that had high migration prevalence versus low migration prevalence. So these communities vary a lot. So some communities have 10% of their population as migrants or ever migrants, and other communities have 70% migration experience. So we basically split our sample into two and said, okay, we're just going to compare these two types of communities. And there's some result that suggests that the response is stronger for both poor and rich households in communities where there's migration prevalence or higher migration prevalence. But we haven't looked at it, especially like in this cascading way, like what happens, 2 years ago, like we only looked at the cumulative numbers. In other words, we didn't look at changes over time. Like last year, I don't know, 2% of the population migrated, or like 5 families migrated. So we could look at that.
Now, you said that looking at person years, the share of migrants is below 1%, but now you said that at the community level, there can be cumulatively quite a high share of migrants. So I'm wondering whether that then even triggers general equilibrium effects, whereby if enough people leave, it makes the market position of the remaining farmers good enough so that they survive on a lower harvest because of price reactions.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't know like how much, I think that's a great point. So there is one shortcoming of this data, right? So we get information on migrants who came back either, or who have someone back home to report on them. So if families left entirely, we wouldn't know about them. So that's kind of, that's one thing. But I think the kind of effect that you're describing could be observed by comparing communities that are very low versus kind of very high on that spectrum. The other thing that people talk about in our field work is that many of these communities have a communal land structure. And these communal lands used to be shared by, let's say, 50 farmers in a community. But then these farmers have many, many children. So now the same land has to be distributed to 5 sons. And now it's not enough. And that's a reason to migrate as well. So there's also kind of that, which is going against kind of what you're describing, but we could look into differences between communities. And we also have this information. Not every community has communal land. So maybe that's something interesting. So we could look at the differentiation by communal land versus, share of migration. Okay, thank you. Okay.
Any other questions? No, then let me thank you once again. That was amazing. Thanks so much for joining us in Melbourne, and I very much hope to see you again